Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Our research-backed videos are engaging, easy to follow, and they help ease the daily challenges like agitation and anxiety so that you can focus on connection and joy. Available by subscription on mobile and TV apps, Zinnia makes every day a little bit easier. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to a collaboration between the History of the Papacy podcast and the podcast of Biblical Proportions. I am joined by Gil. Thank you so much, Gil, for joining us today and for us joining your podcast as well. How are you doing?
Hi, Steven. I'm happy to do this collaboration. I'm doing very well. And I'm kind of looking forward for this episode. It's going to be a little bit different than what we usually do because we're going to stick to history this time.
The history that we're going to stick to today is we're going to be talking about the biblical prophet Jeremiah. And I think in a lot of ways, Jeremiah, he's a top-ranked prophet, but he's maybe not the one you would think of all the time that comes to the fore. And you wouldn't think of him as critical as he is to history. He is planted right in the focus point of so many different streams of and themes of history that come together at this one point, and he is just right in the middle of it. And so he is a prophet of what Christians would call the Old Testament, what in the Hebrew Bible. That's one that's always a little tricky. Hebrew Bible is the thing that oftentimes people will say in the English world. What do you think is the best term to apply that's neutral to the Old Testament, what the Christians would call the Old Testament?
I like the Hebrew Bible. I like that. Old Testament is just like, it's from the Christian perspective, which is fine, but it's not the Hebrew perspective. Hebrew Bible, I like Hebrew Bible. That's what I use.
So the history of this is basically that the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian empires, these general Mesopotamian empires, they're spreading throughout the Fertile Crescent. And it's always good to get an idea of the geography of this area, because you have this Fertile Crescent on the eastern side where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are in what's modern day the country of Iraq, is a very fertile area, well-watered area that produced agriculture, civilization. That's the cradle of civilization. Less so today because of some things that happen in modern times, that it's not quite as fruitful agriculturally. But back then, that was the peak. And all sorts of civilizations popped up in that period. Then you have in the West, along the Mediterranean Sea coast, areas that were well watered and were birthplaces of civilizations. And then along the north, in what's modern day northern Syria, southern Turkey, those two areas connect. And so you get a crescent of area, basically a semicircle of areas that are great for agriculture. They have water, and they all popped up these really strong civilizations. In between those two places is pretty harsh desert, about as harsh a desert as you can get in the whole world. So that makes it, the geography of the area really defines a lot of what's going on. And so you have these empires in the east that would rise up, such as the Syrians. They would go across and conquer this belt of arable land. They would always, there's really only one place to go, and that's to wind up into what was ancient Israel and Judah. There was other places also along the way, the Phoenicians and other civilizations along the way. The Hittites were thrown in there, but you would always wind up, because Judea and Israel, they're really in a critical area. If you think of it, Judea, you couldn't put them in a more critical crossroads of trade that's coming up from the south, from what would have been Nabatea and these places that are bringing spices and gold from Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and eventually from Africa and even Egypt, and then Egypt, India, and then these trade routes from the south, ocean going or sea bearing from the Mediterranean Sea. So you have all of this. It's the natural point where all this conflict is going to come together. The Assyrians pop up out of this great culture of Mesopotamia. They come across, just conquer. And would you say they're not the nicest people that have ever conquered?
Yeah, probably not. Like, there are some nicer people that would conquer you. If I would choose who would conquer me, I would choose the Persians.
Yeah, some nicer ones will come along, and I guess there's a dichotomy there between the Assyrians and how they conquered and ran empire versus how the Persians did, who would come a generation later. The Assyrians come along, they conquer in the 700s-ish BCE. They conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. Then about a generation later, in the 600s, they chip away and bits at a time conquer this southern kingdom of Judah, or Judea. They conquer a couple of cities, and then they essentially leave a core of Jerusalem. And there's a lot of stories in the Bible about them not conquering Jerusalem, but eventually they do get Jerusalem. And that's sort of where this story starts today, is with the conquest of Jerusalem that basically ends this pre-history, you could say, of the Israelite Judean religion. Everything changes after this conquest, and that's where Jeremiah basically parachutes into our story, right into the middle of it.
Right. So let's add, let's take one more step forward, is that after all these amazing Assyrian conquests, and just a few years after their peak, they crumble. They have a dynastic dispute who would replace the dead king Ashurbanipal, and they have a civil war, and all their enemies that have felt their boots on their necks for 100, 200, 300 years, depending who you were, they seize on the opportunity, and there's a Babylonian-Median alliance, and they crush the Babylonians, and they crush the Assyrians. And the former foes of the Assyrians, the Egyptians, because up to then it was just like either Assyria or Egypt. Those were the two options. But once Assyria started to fall and the Babylonians are the emerging power, then the Egyptians think to themselves, okay, maybe a weaker Assyria is better for us than a stronger Babylonia. It doesn't work. There's a new king in town, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He ascends to the throne in 605 BCE. And in this war, it's basically a bipolar world, like, the US and the USSR. And everybody's fighting for the places that are not yet claimed. Okay, as you said, among them Judea. So in 605 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar ascends to the throne, and he is on a roll, and he's about to take all the former Assyrian lands, then the battle for Jerusalem begins. And here is when Jeremiah enters the scene, 605. So the book of Jeremiah, we should say it ahead of time, it's a historical book, a historical account. but it's not arranged in a chronological order. Super confusing. It jumps from one year to another, one king to another, back and forth, back and forth. So it's kind of hard to understand the flow of events. I worked on the book for several reasons and several avenues for a couple of years until I felt like, okay, now I have a good grasp of how the stories evolved, how the events went from one to another, what was Jeremiah's role in each and every critical turn. We don't have to, use here literary analysis or imagination or anything. I think it's going to be very, very clear what was Jeremiah's role in the downfall of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem. And all we have to do is just use Jeremiah's own book against him, because it seems that his role was not very positive. Like if we were, Stephen, if we were Jerusalemites at this time, we would not have liked Jeremiah. We would not.
Before we dive in too deeply, just to maybe talk about the historiography of Jeremiah, did you get a sense of why he wrote this history, but he wrote it jumbled? Was he writing in a different style? Or was he using facts, but maybe trying to arrange the facts in a certain way that didn't come out linearly?
My speculation would be that the book was written in chronological order, but once you put it in a chronological order, as we will see, a lot of very, very difficult and uncomfortable questions are raised about Jeremiah. But if you mess up and jumble up the whole book, then you don't know what came before what was the reaction to what was the consequence to what. And that gives Jeremiah an out to not be considered, a traitor. Let's just call it, because that's what many of his compatriots called him. They saw him as a traitor.
And then maybe before, just to set up a little bit more context, who maybe would have been the opponents of Jeremiah, and where do we know about their works from?
So first, Jeremiah comes into the scene in 605 BCE, comes to Jerusalem, and he's not a Jerusalemite, he's from the land of Benjamin, seems to have been unknown in Jerusalem at that time, comes in immediately, says, we have to bend our knee to Nebuchadnezzar. That's all he's worried about, and that's what he says that Yahweh God told him, that they have to bend the knee. So his enemies are immediately the crown and everybody who is aligned with the crown, which in that time is the priests, okay, the crown, the priests, and they are backed by Egypt. Because this is like a Cold War. Egypt doesn't want the buffer in between to be conquered by Babylonia, and the buffer is Judea, among others. They want them to stand there and be a buffer. So their deal to the Judean king at the time, Jehoiakim, was you don't pay any tribute to Babylon, and we will protect you. If they come over and siege your cities, we will relieve the siege. We will send our armies to help you. So they gain an ally, and the Judean king and his allied priests, they gain money that they don't have to send over to the Babylonians. They don't seem to really care about all, the devastation that would come if the Babylonians would come over. And also they're sure that the priests promise, and some prophets are, pop up and say everything will be fine. The Babylonians will not come. After they come, they would say, okay, they will come, but they will change their prophecies a little bit according to the events. And this we know from Jeremiah's own words, as he's deriding his opponents in what seems to me to be very believable lines, that his political enemies, the priests and some prophets, claim that Yahweh told them, everything will be great, everything will be awesome, nothing bad will happen, everything will be fantastic. And now that everything is decidedly unfantastic, as we will see, he reminds them of their prophecies. He thinks, calls them false prophets.
It's interesting, too, in a lot of ways, that it seems like almost an accident or a fluke of history that Jerusalem will become the biggest player in town, because it's kind of, if you look at the map, it's off in the distance and it's in this hill country that's not very easily accessible. You would think that the northern kingdom, that's more in the heart of things, really close to Phoenicia, really close to Egypt. And then you have Jerusalem that becomes the power, and it's really just because it was the last man standing.
Exactly.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Zinnia offers research-backed videos intentionally created for people with dementia, engaging, calming, and easy to follow. Whether you need to ease agitation, create moments of joy, or make daily routines smoother, Zinnia is here to help. Family and professional caregivers use our content to turn challenges into opportunities for connection. Accessible by subscription on mobile devices and connected TVs, Zinnia is simple to use whenever you need it. Because when caregiving feels easier, life feels better. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
Because Israel was more important, more wealthy, more attractive, so it was conquered earlier. Basically, really. That's the thing. Yeah, it wasn't worth the trouble. And also, we can see that the Babylonians, they didn't want to come to Judea. They didn't want to come to Jerusalem and destroy it. They came several times and didn't destroy it when they were able to cut a deal, until they were like, okay, enough is enough. Enough is enough. So it seems that there wasn't a lot to gain from conquering Judea for them.
So what's the next step with Jeremiah? Let's move forward with this story.
Okay. So he comes in 605 BC and says that, again, that God told him and all... He says that God told him to tell the Judean king and also to all of the kings of the region, right? You have Arameans, you have Jebusites, you have Edomites, you have a million small kings, Edomites, whatever. I said Edomites, Ammonites. All of them, it is very, very important to Yahweh, the Hebrew God, that all of them send tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. Otherwise, he would destroy all of them. So this immediately begs the question that is not answered. Why is this important for the Hebrew God Yahweh? Why is it important for him that not only the Judeans pay tribute, but also the Ammonites and the Edomites and the Jebusites? It seems very, very convenient that right when Nebuchadnezzar comes into power, into an empire that is known for its spying and intelligence and psyops, replacing a previous empire, Assyria, which was also famous for all these things. Suddenly, a man goes into Jerusalem, repeats the Babylonian talking points. Pay him money and everything will be fine. If you don't pay him money, everything will be horrible. He just, instead of saying, says Nebuchadnezzar, he says Yahweh. But other than that, it would be hard to find any differences between what Jeremiah is saying and what the Babylonians were saying. But here something interesting happens that kind of sheds light about the thinking at the time. When Jeremiah is saying all of this, it has a certain effect. But then suddenly he has the money to hire a scribe, Baruch, who wrote his book. And then he dictates to Baruch the same themes and words, and Baruch then reads it aloud to the people. Suddenly, the way that it's described in the book is like now you have to have like a cabinet meeting because some new intelligence has come to light. That's how they treat it. Yahweh is saying that he will destroy Jerusalem if they don't pay up to Nebuchadnezzar. Once that it's written, just people go berserk and it becomes a lot more serious, and Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch become fugitives, like enemies of the state. They have to be hidden from the people working with the king. So this is like a big deal. And up to that point, the reason that Baruch read Jeremiah's prophecies and Jeremiah didn't read them by himself is because that when he was speaking, he was beaten, he was tortured, he was ridiculed. He documented that, some pretty difficult scenes. So it seems that he wanted someone else, Baruch, to do it. His scribe, and his scribe Baruch is also the brother of a minister, so he had some protection, I guess. But this is like he has to go into hiding from the crown. And then, luckily for him, the king dies. The king that wanted him dead, he dies, replaced by his son. Then there's a deal. Okay, we won't destroy Jerusalem. Let his son, the new king, and some generals and soldiers and prophets and priests go to captivity to live in Babylonia, 597 BCE. Babylonians do not destroy Jerusalem, and they install their own king, a pro-Babylonian king. The previous one was pro-Egyptian, right? Now a pro-Babylonian king to make sure that they own this. Tzidkiyahu, Zedekiah. And Jeremiah now is no longer a fugitive. He's close to the regime, talks to the king, he's in the know, until for some reason, we don't exactly know why, Zedekiah switches his coalition and goes with the priests and the Egyptians. Maybe it was for the money. And then Jeremiah becomes again in the opposition. And basically, now this is like a march of folly towards doom, where Jeremiah, increases the volume as the Babylonians get closer and closer and as the siege gets closer. And then if you look at the things that he is saying, some of them he would never have been able to know unless he was working with the Babylonians. And all of a sudden, we'll get into details in a moment. He receives money and land in like hilariously suspicious circumstances that I cannot find any other explanation for, except it was quid pro quo with the Babylonians. He did misinformation and PR for the Babylonians, and they paid him.
Oh, it's fascinating. That's it's classic Cold War, with where the Jerusalem is not maybe the most important thing in the world intrinsically, but it's right in the middle, which makes it really important. And so you can see why you would want to insert somebody like Jeremiah who can ratchet up a certain amount of conflict within Jerusalem to try and pull people towards the Babylonians. And I'm sure the Egyptians were doing something similar, that maybe that didn't get recorded or entered into the record, you might say, of the Bible. But it's classic. I look at it today, the Cold War that happened constantly in flashpoints where each side would feed in, and sometimes it would just simmer and there would be a revolution here, or somebody would get ousted there. And then sometimes it would boil over into outright conflict. You could say Vietnam, 2 generations ago, but you could also say that's happening right now. There's the U.S. has the implants the color revolutions around, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, and we're seeing boiling over. I don't think we're getting too controversial with modern politics here, but I think it's something that we pretend like it's a modern phenomenon, but it's obviously much, much older than that.
Yeah, and we can see how easy it is to have people working within the political establishment or media establishment on the other side, like on your enemy side, and to have them, do your talking points and promote your ideas, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And also some people just like do things for money. It's something that happens that we've seen in the world. And here Jeremiah starts to act like more suspiciously, right? It's not the fact that he came in when Nebuchadnezzar came in that for me paints him as a traitor, or the fact that he's aligned with their talking points. Here you can see that he has two completely different scripts and talking points for two different audiences.
Here, which I think is fascinating about it too, the Assyrians, they knew, or Jeremiah knew, you don't put in somebody who's going to come in and say, oh, well, Marduk says to do this. They know exactly what point, or not even that Nebuchadnezzar says that this is a good thing. They know that Jeremiah knows how to talk the talk to the local people, and he knows how to craft that message that hits every single one of the points that that the local population is going to care about.
Exactly. And he seems like two different people depending on who he's speaking to. When he's speaking to the people, he's telling them, you are all evil and wicked, and this is why you will all die, and this city will be destroyed. He says that 20 different times in very different ways. It's always very, very harsh, right? He's always describing their death gruesomely. So this is what he's telling the people. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed because of you and your wickedness. He also blames the priests, but mostly he's talking to the people and creating, chaos or, fear and stuff like that. But then he's talking to the king, okay? He's talking to Zedekiah several times. And, the conversations recorded there, it's just, he's passing along messages. He's always cool, calm, and collected, never talks about anyone being evil, and just says, no, you just have to pay. If you pay, everything will be fine. You live to live long age, to long age, you'll be respected by your people, everything will be fantastic. But if you do not pay, it's like an offer that you can't refuse. Nebuchadnezzar will catch you. He will speak to you in person, and you will be on trial, and you will die, or your family will die, and you will be imprisoned. He's basically telling him, okay, if you just accept the deal, you're going to get the money, you're going to have a good life. Or if you don't take the deal, then you and your family will die. Why? Why do that? And then he says he's afraid of his coalition with the priests, of his allies, more than he's afraid of Nebuchadnezzar. And I guess maybe sometimes not doing anything makes us feel as if it's like not making a decision, even though it is. Just because not doing anything, okay. But here, Jeremiah has to push things further and further, and he tries to get out of Jerusalem while it's under siege, which is illegal. So he's caught, he's put in prison, he's thrown in the hole, solitary confinement. Then his scribe Baruch manages to take him out. What does he do once he gets out? He goes to the soldiers of Jerusalem, guarding the town, okay, telling them, lay down your weapons and move over to the Babylonians so that you will live. So what kind of person in a besieged city is urging the people there to protect him, lay down their weapons and move on to the other side? Only a person who is not afraid that he himself will be killed in the sacking. Because if you're just a person living there, you don't want the soldiers to abandon their posts. No. Doesn't matter what your political view is about should Judea be aligned with Egypt or Babylonia. That's one thing. But once the Babylonian army, is surrounding Jerusalem, okay, now you want the soldiers there and whatever. If the conflict is here, it's here. So for that, he's sentenced to death. He's supposed to die there, but again, he has some, pull some strings, and he's in prison. He's in prison for working with the Babylonians, okay? So the people living in Jerusalem at the time, they see him as working with the Babylonians. They say he is not working for the good of our people. And then what happens when he's in prison? This is amazing. His supposed cousin comes in from outside of Jerusalem, conquered by Babylonia, okay, walks through, I think it's like a week or something, to Jerusalem, besieges Jerusalem. His cousin somehow enters the besieged city, I don't know how, walks the streets of Jerusalem. He knows where Jeremiah is in the prison, okay, walks to the prison, tells Jeremiah, please buy my land. I want you, Jeremiah, to buy my land. And Jeremiah somehow in prison, he has money on him, on his person, right then and there, buys this land. Somehow Baruch is there to write up a contract, and Jeremiah makes so much efforts to make us think that this deal is legit and on the up and up, that, you know, he's sweating so much that you just like have to see how much he's trying too hard. Like, what are you hiding? And the only way that this makes sense to me is that his supposed cousin lives in Babylonian-controlled territory. The Babylonians will be able to get him inside the city because they are besieging the city. They know where Jeremiah is. They have a little bit of money to pay him back. And then this is how Jeremiah buys his land. And then Jeremiah in prison, he tries to convince everybody that the Babylonians conquering Judea is a good thing. Good for business, because the land will appreciate. If you buy it now on the cheap, then when later Yahweh brings stability to the region, and Yahweh tells you that he will bring stability, then the prices will go up. So this is only a behavior and acts of someone working with the Babylonians. I cannot explain it any other way. But then it gets worse. Do you want to come in before it gets worse?
Oh, wait, do you have a moment? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy. Your support on Patreon goes such a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable and on the air for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in the order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Zinnia offers research-backed videos intentionally created for people with dementia, engaging, calming, and easy to follow. Whether you need to ease agitation, create moments of joy, or make daily routines smoother, Zinnia is here to help. Family and professional caregivers use our content to turn challenges into opportunities for connection. Accessible by subscription on mobile devices and connected TVs, Zinnia is simple to use whenever you need it. Because when caregiving feels easier, life feels better. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
Before it gets worse, can you give us maybe a little bit of a mini background on Baruch and maybe the situation of this family, Jeremiah and Baruch's family? Where do they come from and how do they fit into the the society of that time.
Yeah, so Jeremiah, he comes from a family that supposedly had a long-running beef with the priests. So he might have had an interest a personal interest also in just like being on the other side of whatever side they were on. And it should be said that doesn't matter what Jeremiah did, he was on the correct side of history in terms of the Judeans should not have entered into conflict with the Babylonians. That was insane. Okay. So even if he was getting paid by the Babylonians, like from the bird's eye view, that was the correct cause. So that's one thing. And Baruch, he comes from a noble family. As I said, his brother was a minister. His father was also important. His brother was also an emissary to Babylonians. So they're like on the pro-Babylonian side and not with the priests and the Egyptians. And it's clear from my reading of the book of Jeremiah that Baruch had a lot of connections within the court that was against Jeremiah, right? So it wasn't like a clear-cut thing as like the last few years of the existence of Jerusalem. And he was able to get an audience with the king and to get people to take Jeremiah out of the hole in spite of what other, factions wanted. So there was a lot going on at the time. And we should also say famine, disease. Sieges are tough. They're tough. And the Babylonians basically are waiting for the time to come in. Like they want to come in only when it's just like very, very, very easy, when there will be no resistance. So this is also part of why they did everywhere, not just in Jerusalem, like these psyops and these campaigns that weaken the immune system of the body politic that they want to destroy.
Do you see this as the beginning, too, of this conflict that will rage through the Israelites and then into the Second Temple Jewish religion and into the Maccabees, of this conflict between the priestly caste or priestly class and then the anti-priestly coalition?
Definitely. If I have to trace it, like I haven't dug super deeply into the beginning, but the way that it seems to me, the priests are Judeans, because as a priest you have to be a local from the town, from the mountain, from the tree, whatever magical tree, whatever it is. And the other faction, the anti-priestly faction, I call them judges. They also have a lot of scribes there. It works together. And there, I think they are Israelites. And they moved when the kingdom of Israel was destroyed. They basically took over the politics of Judea by controlling the king, and they pushed away the priests. So already there you have a conflict that began. And then it changes a little bit. And at our time, the priests are back on top, leading Judea, into a void, a cliff. They're going to fall off a cliff. And the judges, as their adversaries, they are out of power, and they're on the side of Jeremiah, basically. These are the divisions. So like the priests, what's important for them is, right, how do you worship your God? What are the exact rules? This is the most important thing, the temple. For the judges, it's law, order, social justice, also geopolitics. It's much, much, much more rooted in facts, right? Because you're a judge. You have to listen to the facts and decide what you think is the correct decision. Priests, they have just like a completely different perspective of reality that cannot meet. I don't know where it meets the perspective of the judges. Just, I guess, momentarily because of some political constellation, it can happen. But just like, even, it's not even ideology. It's just like how you experience and view reality, just completely different.
So you could say the priests they're both, the judges and the priests they're concerned with the secular political situation, but they're approaching it from very different directions. The priests are more purely religious, you might say, where the judges are mixing in. They're a semi-local strongman mixed with religion, mixed with secular politics, all of that combined together. But they don't have that religious, I guess, juju, you might say, or mysticism surrounding them. The priests were priests. We're connected to the very beginning. And so they have, they're drawing sort of their authority from different places. The judges may be more practical, and the priests, it's a little bit more nebulous.
More rigid also, the rules, right?
Yeah.
Like the judges, it seems that their approach to religion is like more loosey-goosey. A good way to contrast is how Hebrews in Genesis worship Yahweh, mostly written by judges, and how Hebrews in Exodus worship Yahweh. So in Exodus, you have a ton of rules for all kinds of things. You have to do this, and you have to wear this cloth that way, and this lamp is here, and this color. Super, super, super specific. Whereas in Genesis, they pour oil over a stone. It's like there's no real process that you have to go through. It's basically channeling your God. If you find, your own way to do it, nobody will tell you that it's wrong. You have traditions. But there's nothing there, like no process that you have to follow in order to connect with your God. Your God is connected with you just because he is connected with you. That's it. That's the way it is.
Yeah, it's hard to read the first 5 books. And if you're not scratching your head that something is different, and that there's definitely 2 different things going on during that, between just from the jump from Genesis to Exodus, not even forgetting where you have something like Leviticus that's actually a law book. Even setting those aside, it's so stark, the difference between Genesis and Exodus, that you have to be scratching your head that there's something going on here.
Yeah, I think what makes it harder is that, first of all, in English, it's harder to notice because you have one translator who's trying to make it all flow seamlessly. So basically correcting things and smoothing out things. So that makes it harder. And also when you come into it already knowing what it's supposed to be, it's just hard to notice the things that you were basically told, not explicitly, but implicitly, don't notice the problems. Don't notice the problems. The problems are a problem. But if you just come in and read it as it is, especially in the language in which it was written, if you just spend some time with the text, then you start seeing things.
That's a point to your point.
Literally, right?
to your point, I think that's something that we can't. I talk about it all the time, but I think you can't belabor it enough, is that in English, we're reading it through at least 3 different translations, and those translations are all piled up full of history. If you're reading a Bible that was, say, a translation from the Septuagint right there is, some of it is they were trying to translate it as literally as possible, almost word for word. And then in other cases, they were translating it very loosely to try and match a more of a Greeky understanding of the text, to try and make it more understandable for Jews living in Alexandria who didn't really even know Hebrew. A lot of them didn't know Hebrew, period. They just spoke the common Greek of the time, and they had a lot more of a Greek outlook to them. So they had to translate it in a way that these people would understand it. So there's changes going on there. And then it got translated into Latin, and then into early English, modern English, and then into modern English. You're talking about potentially 5 major steps that totally confuse everything.
Right, and we think English. Okay, it's in English. We're used to it. But so I live near a really fantastic cathedral that I like very much here in Barcelona, called Santa Maria del Mar. And every Sunday it's open and you can go in. And they have a room there inside with the Bible in Catalan. Okay. It's just a language like English, not as many people speak it, but it's just a language translated just like it was translated to English. So I open whatever on Genesis chapter 1 or whatever chapter I want to read, each time different. And just like I read it in Catalan, I speak Spanish now a little bit, and I speak French, so I can, and also I know the story, so I can understand, right? It's like Latin. It's I think one of the closest modern languages to Latin. But it just feels like a different story. It's not the same story that we know from English or me from Hebrew. Even just like reading any of the biblical stories in French, I'm like, what is this? This is just, the language just like throws it into a different dimension.
Yeah, because you're getting what the translator wanted you to understand of it. And I think that would probably go for any language of any book. I know that Crime and Punishment is a famous one. Older translations of it, you lose such amount of the layering of the story. And there's some newer translations into English, just to use that as an example, that are much more true to the modern, or to what the writer was really trying to say. And so you have to really consider that when you're cracking open your Bible you can't necessarily just read it yourself. You do need to reference a lot of other things and put your mind into that you've got to look in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, it's a shame. I think like you should have a translation that was, written by writers and authors and poets, and just like people who would work to transfer the feeling and the sense and the emotion and the style from one to another. Because Hebrew is very, very different. For me to read, if I read any story that is not written in Hebrew, and not in English, let's say, I would not read it translated to Hebrew. I would read it translated to English, because translated to Hebrew is just different. It comes out old and clunky, doesn't flow well. It has to be Hebrew to be Hebrew. And English is so malleable, you can turn it into anything. But so we should have some people who will turn it as close as they can to the original, intent of the author, as we do for other books, and not only religious theological translations.
Yeah, you need to have people who know the book. They understand what the author is really trying to get by. Like, from my understanding, the Hebrew of, say, the Genesis is very idiomatic, that they're not using the words in a literal sense, that there's a lot of meaning packed into certain words that you were meant to extract from that was something wasn't meant. Like day, I think, is a famous one, if I'm not mistaken. The day can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't just mean a scientific 24 hours from our conception of 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. sort of thing, that you were invited to draw a lot of different meaning out of it. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Zinnia offers research-backed videos intentionally created for people with dementia, engaging, calming, and easy to follow. Whether you need to ease agitation, create moments of joy, or make daily routines smoother, Zinnia is here to help. Family and professional caregivers use our content to turn challenges into opportunities for connection. Accessible by subscription on mobile devices and connected TVs, Zinnia is simple to use whenever you need it. Because when caregiving feels easier, life feels better. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
Yeah, they have very few words. You have, I think, like 8,000 words in the Bible in Hebrew. different words, not total words, right? So you just have to use the few words that you have for many, many, many things. If you just have 8,000 words because you want to say some more stuff. Like English has, I don't know, hundreds and thousands of words, something crazy. You want to go back to Jeremiah cap off his...
so you say that, you say things are about to get worse. How do they get worse for him?
They get worse for everybody. First of all, Jerusalem is destroyed, sacked, burned. The king takes the soldiers and flees. This is also, I think, not discussed enough. And he gets caught, as promised, gets to face Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar in person, as promised. Nebuchadnezzar kills his entire family in front of his eyes, takes out his eyes, and takes him to prison. Okay, so he got what was coming to him, even though I'm not sure his sons were shitty enough to deserve it. I don't know. But interestingly, Jeremiah has two different versions for what happened with him during and after the destruction. And it has to be either or. It can't be both. But still, we have both of them. Okay? In one version, he's in the Jerusalem prison. Somehow he was there when the city was sacked. And for some unknown reason, in the book of Jeremiah, it says that Nebuchadnezzar himself sent his top official there and two other people. So 3 people, a delegation of 3 special people, go to the prison to fetch Jeremiah. So how did they know that he existed? Why did they care so much to fetch him and to get the important people to take him out and save him? And they give him money. It's a double meaning. It could mean that they gave him food and animals, but I think they gave him food and money. Didn't give him, no, not food, animals and money. But whatever the case, even if it's just gifts and food, okay. And just I don't know what the explanation could be for why they would go to all this trouble in a city that they just destroyed and sacked, to go to the prison and look for some guy who was helping them, okay? He was helping them even if he weren't paid. He was doing their bidding. Maybe God told him. But he was there, passing along their propaganda and getting people to despair and trying to get soldiers to not fight. So he was working for them whether he knew it or not. But it seems that they knew it. So this is one version. Then there's another version. And in the other version is that he was arrested, swept with the rest of the Hebrews after the destruction. And then somehow this official, top Babylonian official, Nebuzaradan, recognizes him from all the masses of the thousands of people that now are in chains. And he comes to him, and there he frees him and gives him the money and the gifts and whatever. And then he tells him, you can go to Babylonia with your people, and I will take care of you over there and make sure that you're safe. Or you can go wherever you like here, just in Judea. You go south, you go north, go wherever you want. Bye. It's like I compared it to, you're with your friends, whatever, doing something illegal in a parallel universe. Then the police come in, but they arrest everybody. But one of your friends, they free him, give him money, and tell him you can go. Who is the guy that snitched on you? It's that guy. Yeah. It can't be anybody else. It's that guy.
And those are two mutually exclusive stories. There's no way you can say that they're just a different perspective. They are two different things altogether.
Where were you?
Two different
in the
events.
Prison or outside?
Yeah.
So, and also Nebuzaradan tells Jeremiah, this is according to the book, right? Tells Jeremiah the exact same talking points that Jeremiah himself has been saying before the destruction. Okay, Nebuzaradan basically repeats Jeremiah's own prophecies to him. He comes in and tells him, Yahweh destroyed the city because the Hebrews were sinned. This is why he brought us. He told you that he would do this, and now he did it because of you. So the Babylonians, it seems to me that they gave these talking points to Jeremiah ahead of time, and now they're just like closing the deal here, saying, okay, this is what happened. We were brought here, Yahweh brought us. Okay. I don't think that they really believe that Yahweh brought them, because they conquered a whole bunch of places, not just this place. So just like the only reasonable explanation that explains all of the suspicious behavior from the beginning, him popping into the scene right when Nebuchadnezzar needed him, for no reason, claiming that it's very important for God that the Ammonite king pays tribute to Nebuchadnezzar without explaining why, other than I gave this land to Nebuchadnezzar. And then Jeremiah working so hard and also passing along messages. And I forgot something. The best thing. Okay, I forgot. In one of his back and forths with Zedekiah, that happens right after there are reports that the Egyptians are sending their forces to relieve the siege, okay? Jeremiah goes to the king and tells him something that he does not know yet. Okay, doesn't have that information yet. That the Egyptians did a U-turn and went back to Egypt. Okay, so the king is waiting for the Egyptians, and Jeremiah comes in and tells him, Yahweh told me that the Egyptians are already going back to Egypt. How does he know troop movements? Like, it's very important to, for God to let him know the troop movements at the time. Now the Babylonians told him that the Egyptians went back. They told him what to say. They paid him, okay, with money and with land. And then they made sure that he was safe and sound. Afterwards, they extracted him from the situation and they completed their side of the deal. And so, here you go. You have your land. You have these cattle. You have money. Go. Unfortunately for him, a month later, he has to immigrate to Egypt because there's too much trouble going on in Judea and they all have to leave. But he doesn't want to leave. He's like super, super adamant about wanting to stay. And I think because you can't take your land to Egypt, the land that he got in prison, while he bought in prison for treason, as he was arrested for treason. So like, if you want to, betray your country, do it while you're in prison for treason. That's the best way to do it, I think.
Why do you think he went to Egypt and not to Babylon?
In Babylon, all his enemies were, right? All the priests, they were taken to Babylon. He went to Egypt. It wasn't of his own accord. It's just like the entire community got up and left, like scores of them, fearing that the Babylonians would come back because the people affiliated with the priests, one of them assassinated the governor. Yeah, a Judean man assassinated the Hebrew governor the Babylonians picked. And then the Hebrews are like, we're scared the Babylonians will come over and blame us and kill us all or take us captive to Babylonia. And these are the pro-Babylonians, right? And they're like, let's just pack up and move to Egypt. All right. They weren't pro-Egyptians. They go to Egypt and they become the community that you mentioned earlier, thriving later in Egypt, first in Pharaonic Egypt and then in Hellenistic Egypt. It's this exact community, and Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah, becomes one of the most important Hebrews, during his lifetime and in the centuries afterwards.
Is this where you sort of see that there's a split going on between, and really two separate communities come out of this, Babylonian Jews and then Alexandrian Egyptian Jews, and sort of the Jews in the middle too?
And the Babylonian Jews, they become Persian Jews. So you have a lot of these interesting layers in the Bible that are always, I feel like these texts, it's like a snapshot in time. It's like a picture, just with a lot of details. It was written at a specific time and place because of all kinds of reasons that you can basically see in the text if you begin with the text and look for it, right? It's like a movie in the 80s is different than a movie today. You just watch it for 3 minutes and this is from the 80s. the video quality, the shot, the dialogue, whatever it is, before you even look into it, you kind of know, okay, this is off. This looks too. Music also, we can tell if it's from the 70s or the 90s. It's very easy, right? So it's really interesting that we have all of those shades in the Bible.
I think that you lay out a really interesting case. And at first I was a little confused, or maybe not understanding why Jeremiah, because we know Jeremiah and Baruch go to Egypt, but it makes sense that he can't go to Babylon, even though the Babylonians are his pals. You can't go to Babylon when all of your enemies are there as well, who were taken in exile. So that makes perfect sense. He can't stay probably as much as he would like to stay in Judea and farm the land and do whatever an ancient world rancher oligarch does. So he has to go to Egypt. What was his life in Egypt like?
Wow, once you read his chapters, he has like 4 or 5 chapters written in Egypt. And there, the sense that you get is that, first of all, he was alone. He spent his time berating his people, just going there and just cursing at them because they were very Egyptianized and they had no problems with Egyptian religion, among other things. And we know that also from archaeology and history, that Hebrews in Pharaonic Egypt and then in Hellenistic Egypt, they were Pharaonized, whatever, and then Hellenized in the specific Egyptian sense. And he hates it, and he makes all these predictions and prophecies that they would all be destroyed, and Egypt would be destroyed, and Phoenicia would be destroyed. And he's like wrong on many, many accounts. But what we do remember for him is that he was right about the Babylonians, even though he got paid to say it. But still, he's on record. It's interesting. Like for me, I struggle to see, like, even if he was a traitor, but he was also on the right side. It's kind of a tough call. Like, what do you think? What's your sense of it?
For himself, I would say that it was probably the right call 100%. Is you hitch your cart to the Babylonians and because they were going to win. I think if you were sitting there, you could be the king of Jerusalem and think that you're going to hold out. And right. There was evidence that you had held out before, but this is the end of the line, guys. And it should have been obvious. There was the Battle of Lachish that had happened, and that major center was taken out. And it was obvious that they were closing up on Jerusalem. And whether it was going to happen today, tomorrow, in a generation, the game was over. Jeremiah saw that. What I feel bad for Jeremiah, and I think it's a common story, is that he didn't ultimately get to do what he wanted to do. It comes out that he's an exile. He's a refugee, and he has to live in a place he doesn't want to live in. And he just rails against that. And so it really does. It comes forth out of the text that things did not play out the way he thought they would.
Exactly. Like, he got paid and everything, but at the end of the day, first of all, being right about a horrible, horrible disaster, that's something that you can't feel good about, because the result is horrible and sad. And even if he worked for the Babylonians, he didn't want thousands of people to die, right? It's not like he's a monster. I'm guessing, like, as you said, at first, this is the good, you're hitching your cart, not only to the winner, but just like it makes sense. And you can tell yourself, okay, I'm going to promote peace instead of war. But once, like, intelligence services, once they have a hook in you, then they can just, like, slowly but surely move you along to do things that you would not do at the onset. Like, someone would tell you, come on, we want you during war to ask the soldiers to give up their weapons and move to the other side. You would have said no. But then when you go, step by step by step by step by step, each step is a small one that makes sense. And then at the end, you find yourself in a hole. And if it weren't for Baruch, he would have died in whole.
One thing that I'm having a difficult time wrapping my head around, and it's probably part of it because I don't know as much about the process of how the Hebrew Bible was canonized, but this is an anthology, and there has to be a reason why this book gets inserted. Many other books don't get inserted. How does this one make the cut? And what I'm thinking is because it really is this push and this pull between the Egyptians and the Babylonian. The Egyptian, they're not even exile Jews because they had lived there for so long. They could have lived anywhere they wanted, and they lived in they lived in Egypt and eventually Alexandria. They become Alexandria had 5 quarters, and 2 of them were entirely Jewish. So they're obviously a powerful element there. The Babylonians, they take on this whole idea of exile. It becomes a part of their fiber, even though they many of them stayed in Babylon, and they could have gone back to Judea many times over. Why does Jeremiah get put into a canon?
This is a very interesting question. The answer is very interesting. We won't get now into the tiniest details, but Jeremiah not only was right about the destruction of Jerusalem, he was wrong about many things, but on that he was right, and he spoke about it, several times. Other people were wrong. So that's one reason. Also, when he gets disappointed by the Babylonians, he starts to prophesy against them. And he says that they will be destroyed in 70 years. That's what he said, 70 years. But he says 70 twice. And what happens is that Babylonia is destroyed after 49 years, which is 7 times 7. So it kind of seems like he was right. And that if he was right about Jerusalem and about Babylonia, it means that God spoke to him. While other people were wrong. So many people were wrong. So then the Hebrews in Persian times, I think that it happened after Persia conquered Egypt in 525 BC, and then the Hebrews in Egypt and in Persia basically lived in the same realm and they could visit each other. It's just like the idea that this man that we've been talking about, hated, reviled, God actually spoke through his mouth. It blows their mind. This is like the opening line of the book of Ezra, a historical book. So and so years after Yahweh had spoken through Jeremiah's mouth. And the fact that he suffered and never gained anything for it, just like was ridiculed and beaten and tortured, it's just like it's an incredible story. And right after Egypt is conquered and everything is Persia, and the Hebrews in Egypt can communicate with the Hebrews in Persia, and they can send each other their stories. And I think Genesis was written by Baruch and Jeremiah, basically. And it was only, and the Persians knew, and the Hebrews in Persia and Babylon knew nothing about it only after 525. And then we see 522 BCE, 521 BCE. Suddenly you have prophets in Persia coming out and saying, we have to rebuild the temple now. There has always been a plan. We have to do it right now. Haggai and Zechariah, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And I think this has to do with somehow the feeling that Yahweh spoke through his mouth, and somehow his works and Baruch's works complete the works of the Hebrews in Babylonia and Persia. And there is, a puzzle here. And now we have to rebuild the temple, and we have to do everything according to the rules in order to prevent another disaster, because they believe that their previous disaster was because they didn't follow the rules. So in that way, Jeremiah becomes a crucial figure, a divine figure, but also a tragic figure, right? No matter what we think about him. As you said, things never turned out the way he wanted to, even when he supposedly, everything went his way, he got paid and stuff. No, his life was hard. So it's kind of like, I think, this dissonance between Yahweh speaking to him and through him and his horrible, miserable life. Wow, it's a potent story, I think.
That's what I think is really fascinating of what you brought up, is that all these things, all these threads come together, and they're not just textual anymore. They're verifiably historical, that they can be proven through other sources. Haggai and Zechariah, it's verifiable that both of those books, big portions of them happened during it was a couple of month period, I think, and that's verifiable by other sources. And the things that Jeremiah is talking about are all being used because the temple, that was the absolute obsession, because they had to build that temple. There was no secular thing to build up after that. But the temple is the thing that recreated this people.
Right, and they only started to build it a few years after the Hebrews living in Persia, who built the canon, could have found out about Jeremiah. They didn't have the book of Jeremiah, didn't have stories written by Baruch and Jeremiah. Only after 525, and then immediately they start talking about the urgency of rebuilding the temple, and then it takes a few years, and only then the temple has been rebuilt, even though they were already in Judea for 20, 30 years earlier, right? So I think this shows like Jeremiah's crucial theological importance of how, his prophecies, or whatever you want to call them, Babylonian talking points, how with everything that happened since that time, now they're viewed as something, unbelievable. This actual person that we know lived and mistreated by our ancestors, the priests, and also by regular people, our God spoke through his mouth. It's just like unfathomable, I think, for them. And it just like pushes them to, prevent another disaster by this time doing everything down to the T.
You did tons and tons of episodes on Baruch and Jeremiah writing the Old Testament, but just to connect it, or not the Old Testament, the Genesis and bits and pieces of Genesis. And we don't need to go into all of that, but just to touch into that and just to bring it in a little bit, would they have, I think that I'm getting the sense that there would have been shared stories that all Jews would have known. Would that have been like the core of Genesis, and then Baruch and Jeremiah redact it and touch it up, and that's the thing that come around the time of the Persians, that's the thing that connects everybody? You could be an Alexandrian Jew, you could have been or not at that point, you wouldn't have been an Alexandrian Jew, you would have been an Egyptian Jew, but you would have been or if you had been a Jew who lived in Judea, a Babylonian Jew, there was these common threads of stories, and then the redaction, the layers that were built in by Baruch and Jeremiah, that's the thing that pulls everybody together.
Yeah, the way that I see it, I think this, like what you mentioned, this is like more of an academic view. I think so. The way that I see it, I think it was very, very organic. First of all, like the book of Genesis includes like many, many stories, Sumerian stories and Assyrian stories, Babylonian stories, just like from a Hebrew perspective. So I think it draws on like general stories that were indeed out there, but just like telling them from a Hebrew perspective that is always about what happened before, during, and after the destruction of Jerusalem. Outside of the priestly stories in Genesis, which are few and far between and are almost always like a repetition of another story, like the main emotional stories like the Garden of Eden and Cain and Abel and Abraham walking around and his sons, all the really dramatic stories, they are always about what happened before, during, and after the destruction of Jerusalem. For example, one of the versions of the flood, if you read it after you read Baruch's accounts about the destruction of Jerusalem, you read the account, there are two flood stories connected, right? You read one of them, then you see, oh, this is about the destruction of Jerusalem. Sodom and Gomorrah, oh, it's about the destruction of Jerusalem. Abraham suddenly arguing for no reason about how he doesn't want anyone to think that he took money from a foreign king. There's a story about that. This is because Jeremiah took money from a foreign king. And the promised land, I think the promised land is about the land that Yahweh promised Jeremiah. And then Jeremiah, like Abraham and like Isaac and like Jacob and like Joseph, found himself in Egypt, far away from his promised land, like Jeremiah.
Wow.
So I think basically that's insane. That's insane. If you go and look and read how the contract that Jeremiah did in prison is written, it's basically a legal version of the same contract, of the contract that Abraham does with Yahweh, with the cutting of the covenant of the pieces. Okay, it's like very, very detailed. It's the same. I did a few episodes about it. But also, even Abraham has a nightmare and he wakes up in Egypt. And it feels like Jeremiah was in a nightmare. Oh my God, I'm in Egypt. I'm not in near my land. And there was also a story, whatever, about the first war in history, supposedly, where someone is running and a king is fleeing, a local king of Sodom flees from an evil Eastern king and is caught near the Dead Sea. That's what happened to Zedekiah, I mentioned earlier. He fled and he got caught near the Dead Sea. So basically, all of the stories of Genesis are in some way or fashion about what happened outside of the stories written by priests, are about what happened before, during, and after the destruction of Jerusalem from the perspective of the people who immigrated, who had to leave their land and move away. This happens to Adam. This happens to Noah, happens to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph. They all end up away from their land, and most of them end up in Egypt because the people who wrote it, that's what happened to them. They're writing stories about their community for their community. Later, 100 years later, someone connected it to the other canon when Persia conquered Egypt and all that, and then it just became something else, a missing piece from a theological puzzle, and then they think that the promised land is a real promised land, and now they are returning to their promised land. So then it becomes something else. That's how I see it.
This is just really incredible, and I think we've left people with a lot to think about. I know that I'll be thinking for a long time after this. People, I highly encourage you, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, something you agree with, something you find outrageous, definitely send us in your comments, because we would love to talk about them some more and throw that into the mix.
Definitely. It's very, very interesting, and everybody can go and read about Jeremiah themselves, right? You can go, forget for a moment about the stories of Genesis. Just, if you go even to Wikipedia or whatever, just like read about Jeremiah, all the events that I mentioned, they are there. I don't know if there are a lot of ways to interpret it other than the way that we did. If you have, please reach out. I couldn't think of any reason. I wasn't like a Jeremiah hater, looking to see him as a traitor. It just seems odd. Everything is odd unless you look at him as a traitor. And then if you put up the stories of Genesis against what happened to him, it's just like everywhere it clicks, including the hole, right? Joseph was thrown into a hole and then taken to Egypt. And then in Egypt he prospered, not like Jeremiah, like the Hebrew people at large. So it's just like on and on and on and on. Every single story will have some perspective on what happened to them, which were very, very dramatic things that happened to them.
So I think we'll leave it at there today. Gil is, of course, the host of the podcast of Biblical Proportions. Look in the comments below or in the show notes, and we'll have links for how to find his podcast. You can find links to my podcasts as well. And definitely look forward to more collaborations in the future. You want to tell us a little
bit about your podcast, Stephen, to my audience?
So my podcast is the History of the Papacy podcast, but it's grown into something more than just the history and a biography of the popes of Rome. I've really dug into a lot of the Christian side of the Bible, and especially digging into the roots of Christianity in Second Temple Judaism and beyond. So, look, if that's something that you're interested in, especially based on our conversation, we have many episodes, especially with our mutual collaborator, Gary Stevens of the History of the Bible podcast. We've delved into a lot about the New Testament and its connections into this tumultuous era of the Second Temple.
I will soon be in the U.S. for some time. So in U.S. time, we can do a three-way collaboration about something that connects Judaism and Christianity. I'm very, very interested.
Yeah, that would be incredible. So definitely leave those comments, and we will talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you, Stephen. Bye.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.
Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Zinnia offers research-backed videos intentionally created for people with dementia, engaging, calming, and easy to follow. Whether you need to ease agitation, create moments of joy, or make daily routines smoother, Zinnia is here to help. Family and professional caregivers use our content to turn challenges into opportunities for connection. Accessible by subscription on mobile devices and connected TVs, Zinnia is simple to use whenever you need it. Because when caregiving feels easier, life feels better. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.